I sent you a message on the Slack.
Thanks for folks who pointed out that the chat was initially disabled. You should be able to actually use it now. And we'll get started in just a minute here. All right. George, if you want to pause the music. Hi, and welcome. We are so pleased to have you here for today's webinar, How to Design an Equitable Retirement Plan. My name is Mika Weinstein, and I'm the COO for Just Futures, the host of this event. We are thrilled by how much interest we've gotten in this webinar, and it's lovely to see both familiar and new names joining. We have a lot of content to cover today, so let's get started. If you haven't already, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box. We'd love to know who you are and why you joined the webinar today. If you're having any technical issues, there are instructions for contacting Zoom webinar support on the screen, and we'll be dropping that in the chat as well. We do have time set aside at the end of the webinar for some Q&A with our speakers. To submit a question, you can locate the Q&A feature on your toolbar. If you put the question in the chat, we may miss it, so do try to use that Q&A tool. All right, before we get into the content, a quick primer on Just Futures. We are a people of color owned investment advisory firm that's driven by and accountable to social justice values. We offer retirement plans like 401ks and 403bs, asset management for organizations who want their reserves or endowments to be managed in a values-aligned way. And we also offer back office support for private impact funds. Our mission is to deliver financial solutions that support a just transition to a regenerative economy. If you aren't familiar with Just Transition, we'll be dropping a link in the chat in a moment here with more information, but essentially it's a framework for moving away from economic practices that extract from people and planet and moving towards practices that support ecological and social well-being, democratized wealth, racial justice, and more. Towards that end, we are partially owned by a group of nonprofits who organize around Just Transition. And if you'd like to learn more about our unique ownership model, again, we'll drop some information in the chat for you. Thank you so much to our incredible co-sponsors for helping to get the word out to all of you who've joined today. As You Sow, Common Future, Full Spectrum Capital Partners, Funders for Justice, Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, Justice Funders, Resource Generation, Solidaire, Transform Finance, U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, Vega Mala Consulting, and Vestwell. If you aren't familiar with some or all of these organizations, we encourage you to check them out. I will briefly introduce today's speakers and then we'll get started with the event. So I've already introduced myself. Today, you'll also be hearing from the CEO of Just Futures, George Guerrero, and our very new Manager of Coalitions and Worker Power, Lisa Acorley. A little later on, you'll also get to hear from Andy Behar, the CEO of As You Sow, and Alberto Mejia, the COO of Fractured Atlas. Finally, Alex Sangchin, who is the co-founder and president of Just Futures, will be moderating the Q&A at the end of the event. So to give you a little bit of a roadmap here, I'll start out by setting some context. What does retirement have to do with equity anyway? I'll then talk about how employers can help close wealth gaps through how retirement plans are designed. George and Lisa will walk you through the relationship between the finance sector, investing, and equity, with an emphasis on what it actually looks like to try to align an organization's retirement investments with their values. We'll have Andy share a few specific tools that can be helpful in that effort from As You Sow. And then we'll chat with Alberto very briefly as a mini case study to have you hear from someone who has implemented, I think, really all of the practices that we'll mention here today at their organization. And then finally, we'll have some time at the end where you can ask questions of our speakers. All right, what does retirement have to do with equity? So when we talk about equity and money in the workplace, that conversation generally has focused on salary. And, that's, of course, very important to address. But as I'm sure many of us here know, the racial wealth gap is 3 times larger than the racial income gap. As you can see in this chart, if we continue with current trends, the racial wealth gap will continue to widen further. Similarly, gender wealth gaps are greater than the income ones there. And so this is where retirement comes in. Almost a third of household wealth is held in the form of retirement assets. That's huge. And a large part of why retirement savings are such a driver of household wealth is because of the power of compounding interest, or the additional earnings that come from your interest being reinvested over time. So that's shown here by the darker blue bars on the top of the chart. As you can see, the majority of the gains come from that compounding effect. So those who have the means to invest and let their investments sit untouched get to benefit from those effects. Surprisingly, we see the same racial disparities when looking directly at median retirement savings as we do with wealth overall. So whose responsibility is it? Do we just tell people of color and women to save more for retirement? That would be the American way. We won't do a full history lecture here, but over the last 40 years, we've seen a shift from what was considered more of a collective responsibility to an individual one. Pensions and Social Security used to play a bigger role in providing long-term financial security. With the rise in what are called defined contribution plans, including the popular 401ks and 403bs, that responsibility has shifted to fall primarily on the individual, from deciding how much to save down to selecting how to invest those retirement funds. Culturally, as well, there's a widespread emphasis on financial literacy. We think that framing the problem as one of illiteracy places the onus or blame on the individual rather than recognizing that we can and should take a collective approach to ensuring financial security. Just Futures released a report back in 2022 that goes into more detail about how we can and should push for sector-wide solutions to move that responsibility back up the ladder. We'll share a link in the chat and in our follow-up email with so you can access this report. But today we're going to focus mostly at the organizational level. And on that note, Chitra Iyer, who authored this report, recently shared on the Fund the People podcast that contributing to employee retirement is the single best way for an organization to address that racial wealth gap. So now we'll move into talking about some specifics around how plan design setup can impact equity. Is it enough to just offer retirement benefits? Spoiler, no. But first, let me acknowledge, we recognize that many organizations out there, particularly smaller ones, don't currently offer retirement benefits. And we know that's often due to concerns about budget and operational capacity. That's not our focus today, but we will give a shout out here to one of our main partners, Vestwell. They have, through their plan administration work, automated a lot of the compliance, record keeping, and reporting processes that used to make offering a retirement plan such a huge headache. So if you're in that camp and you have questions, reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk about what's involved. But we will turn our focus for the next few slides toward what an individual organization who does or wants to offer retirement can do to support an equitable distribution of those benefits. All right, so let's say you have or are setting up a 401k or 403b plan. What are some of the primary features that play into equity? We're going to look at these one at a time. So starting with eligibility. Unsurprisingly, taking a universal approach to eligibility is going to generally produce more equitable outcomes. This means including part-time workers in your plan, not putting in long service requirements before an employee becomes eligible to participate. Women work part-time at nearly double the rate of men in the US, so excluding part-time workers from retirement plans has a disproportionate impact on women's ability to save. In terms of enrollment, traditionally, that process was designed to be opt-in, meaning that you had to complete some kind of enrollment process, sometimes mailing forms physically in, before you could start deferring into your retirement account. Automatic enrollment has become increasingly popular and is actually mandated by recent legislation for new plans that are being spun up starting next year. With auto enrollment, everyone who's eligible for the plan is automatically set up to contribute somewhere between 3 and 10% of their paycheck into their retirement account, even if they take no action. They can always opt out, so no one's forced to participate, but we can see there are much higher rates of participation when the default is to join the plan. Most people learn about finances from their families. And if a worker has to not just jump through hoops, but feel confident that it's the right decision to participate in order to get over that mental barrier and do the process of joining, you can see how a traditional opt-in approach could reinforce existing disparities. On top of that, offering auto enrollment, ideally organizations are setting that default savings rate to higher than the 3% minimum, to help encourage and normalize a higher savings rate for their staff. Right. Employer contributions. This is a big one. The traditional approach when an employer does make some kind of contribution for their staff has been to offer a match in order to incentivize employees to save more. That sounds great in theory. We want staff to be saving for retirement. Unfortunately, the reality is that this setup often ends up exacerbating wealth gaps. So let's use an example to help us. In this case, an organization is offering a 4% flat match. So you can see staff person 1 is saving 8% of their own salary and getting 4% of that matched. Staff person 2 is doing the full 4% match. The staff person 3 is getting 2% of the match, and staff person 4 is saving nothing. So staff person 4 might be, for example, a lower paid staff person who may not feel like they can afford to save for retirement. Contrast that with a 4% guaranteed, or the industry jargon is non-elective contribution. In this case, every staff person is saving at least 4%. You can see the overall savings rate is less skewed, And the actual resources that are coming from the organization are being distributed more equitably instead of only going to, in most cases when it's a match, those who are already the highest earners at the organization. One additional note I want to make here: some organizations may be staunch on offering a match instead of guaranteed. And if that's the case, we strongly encourage you to look at the newly offered option under the legislation Secure 2.0, which allows employers to treat student loan payments as contributions that qualify for a 401k or 403b match. In other words, an employee can make a student loan payment that amounts to, let's say, 4% of their paycheck and defer nothing to retirement, and using that student loan payment be eligible for the 4% employer match contribution into their retirement account. Next up, fees. I could do an entire webinar on fees in the retirement industry, and maybe one day I will. The first step is actually knowing what fees you and your employees are paying. The retirement industry largely has set their fee structure to be intentionally opaque, and many providers make their plans appear very affordable, to employers at least, because most of the costs, and sometimes exorbitant costs, are actually being deducted directly from participant retirement accounts. Let's say, for example, that a provider is charging all employees 0.85% of their retirement balance each year for record keeping fees, and that number is pulled from a real plan. While that might not sound like a lot, less than 1%, because of the power of compounding interest that we introduced earlier, the loss to the employee is not just the fee itself, but what the fee would have earned in returns by being reinvested over decades. That could add up to tens of thousands of dollars, if not more. So here's a graph from the Reclaiming Retirement for All report that shows the impact fees can have, even using, relatively conservative assumptions around savings rates and returns. In this example, the difference between 1% in fees and 2% accounts for an almost $70,000 difference after 40 years of investing. So if you want help interpreting how much your employees might be currently paying in fees, we're going to provide a way to get in touch at the end of the webinar. Finally, one element that's probably discussed less often in the industry: the importance of having an advisor that staff trust and can relate to. Black and Latinx workers are more likely to have experienced unfair treatment by financial services companies. So as a result, they understandably have less trust in the stock market, and that can lead to taking a lower risk investing strategy. That generally translates over time into lower returns, which results in the same kind of compounding losses that we saw with higher fees. So this visual shows similar information in a different format, but a possible difference of over $1 million in savings between a conservative and aggressive strategy, again, over 40 years, in this case with a difference in 5% between those. When we asked about 120 nonprofits to rate their current retirement plan provider across several criteria, we found that existing providers out there scored the lowest on providing good quality, engaging training and advising. Comments further expounded the difficulty that young, diverse nonprofit employees found relating to overwhelmingly older white male retirement advisors. The hope is that with an advisor they can trust, staff may be more inclined to put savings towards retirement and invest it in a way that garners them better financial security in the long run. So it might be a little easier to think about taking these factors into account if you're setting up a plan for the first time. If you already have a plan, though, everything that we've discussed is possible to change. Many employers end up staying with the same provider for decades without really looking at how fees could be cheaper elsewhere, or thinking about possible changes to the plan structure. For most of these, you would contact your provider to make the request. There's probably going to be a one-time fee to make a change. And for those who want to look at changing providers, I know it can be daunting. In most cases, it's a pretty painless process. Alberto, who you'll hear from later, was not one of the lucky ones, but he made it through. And with that, I will hand it over to George to share more on the investment side of the agenda today.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mika. So we've covered how the design itself of a plan can impact the equity of how organizational resources are distributed to staff. So let's talk about how equity at the broader societal level is impacted by where those retirement funds are invested. While it's not typically front and center in people's everyday lives, the financial services sector has an outsized impact on society. Over $43 trillion is managed by Wall Street, which overwhelmingly prioritizes investments that will garner the highest returns for the primarily white male investor class at the expense of workers, communities, and the environment. And this is on top of another $23 trillion controlled by the banking industry. Across the last few decades, the finance sector has accounted for 7 to 8% of GDP, but reaping 25 to 30% of all corporate profits. What that translates to is the wealthy getting even wealthier, as their capital makes up the vast majority of Wall Street investments. The finance sector is effectively getting huge payouts for supporting this entrenchment of wealth. How does this excess profit impact our communities and planet? Now, we could probably host a whole series of webinars just focused on answering this question, but the interest of brevity, we'll share a few quick examples. Since the focus of this webinar is on equity, the examples you see on the screen here relate to that context. The first one is a direct impact from the finance industry itself. Numerous reports have detailed how big banks have engaged in predatory lending that takes advantage of lower income Black and brown borrowers. There are rampant examples of discrimination, from redlining, higher interest rates, higher fees, to worse loan terms for people of color. The investments in which Wall Street engages include financing private prison and immigration detention operators, investing in companies that produce toxic pollution with an outsized impact on minority communities, and investing in companies that discriminate in the workplace. In this system that is geared for those at the top to extract and hoard wealth, what can we do as organizations and individuals to invest in a way that takes better care of people, communities, and our planet? We're going to walk through the steps of how an organization could better align their retirement investments with their values. Now, to be clear, most of what we'll be describing is not what the HR staff at an organization would do. They're certainly busy enough. They would ordinarily hire an investment advisor, like Just Futures, to do that work. But we want you to have a good understanding of what that looks like so you can be better prepared to ask questions and assess the type of advisors you may want to hire. Okay, to make sure we're on the same page, let's start with a little primer on the investment vehicles that most retirement accounts are invested through. First, let's make a distinction between public and private markets, as this will come into later on in the conversation. Public market investments are more widely available to individual investors, defined as financial markets where investments are traded on exchanges and more readily available to the public. Examples would be an individual company stock or fund that bundles together different security types like stocks and bonds. The most popular fund types are mutual funds and exchange-traded funds, each generally with a specific focus. For example, that focus may be on the size of a company or the geographic area or targeting a specific or certain risk or return profile. The vast majority of retirement accounts are invested in public market investments through a combination of mutual funds and ETFs that together are designed for long-term growth. There are some clear advantages to public market investments. They have higher level of liquidity, meaning you can more easily buy and sell your investments on a day-to-day basis. The fund vehicles themselves make diversification easier, which helps manage risk. Just to frame that for you, think of it as the classic lesson of, don't put all your eggs in a single basket. Perspective to recognize, however, is that these public market investments represent just a fraction of the overall market. Of the tens of millions of businesses in the US, you can really only invest in a small subset of those, about 4,000, through public market exchanges. Private market investments, on the other hand, are effectively the investments that are not traded on a public exchange. This could include investing in private real estate, private equity, or giving a loan to a small business. While it's not unheard of, it's actually pretty rare for people to be able to invest in private options through their retirement accounts. Okay, with that as a foundation, we can think about how an organization or an individual might use criteria, or as they're called in the industry, investment screens, to better align a portfolio of investments with our values, with the end goal of investing in the equitable future we all want to create. On this slide, each of these stacks represent a fund, where the layers are individual stocks or bonds that the fund is invested in. There are two types of screens to have in mind: negative screens, or trying to reduce investments in companies or industries that we don't want to support, and positive screens, trying to increase investments in companies or industries we do want to support. Let's start with the negative. As we've already named, there are many actions that a corporation or industry could engage in that would make us not interested in investing in them. Examples are on the slide. Examples that are on the slide: Amazon and ExxonMobil. So how do you actually screen them out? Do we have direct influence over how these funds are invested? Not exactly. So investment advisors like Just Futures decide which funds are used in your retirement plan. And because there are tens of thousands of funds out there, we can make those selections based on criteria that include values-driven screens. There are tools that help investment advisors aggregate data and evaluate funds across a range of issue areas. Two examples that we use at Just Futures are As You Sow and Your State. In a bit, we'll have Andy Behar from As You Sow share how you, as an individual, can use their tool to assess your current plan. Your Stake doesn't have the same public-facing option, but for investment advisors like us, they offer data or dozens of additional issue areas like racial justice, labor rights, and community health for us to make that analysis. It is meaningful to use screens to minimize our investments in some of the worst actors. But how far can negative screens really take us? The honest truth is there are a number of limitations. First, if we are only picking funds, not which direct stocks or bonds we're investing in, we are limited by the funds that are out there and which investments the managers of those funds decide to bundle together. We currently can't cherry pick which investments are included or excluded ourselves. Just Futures is actually working on different approaches, which would enable us to better customize a portfolio. But it's going to actually take some time for us to achieve the necessary scale before we can make that available to our retirement clients. Secondly, funds that take into account environmental, social, or governance factors, or so-called ESG funds, have become much more popular in the last few decades. But unfortunately, that popularity has also been accompanied by the rise of greenwashing and impact washing in the investment space. In other words, an asset manager may present themselves or their funds as having more values aligned than they actually are. Shocker, right? Marketing can make it more difficult for consumers who don't have a background necessarily in finance to accurately assess how aligned the fund is in reality. Thirdly, investment advisors are subject to regulations from the federal government that dictate the criteria to select retirement plan funds. This makes it more difficult for an advisor to create a portfolio that completely excludes, for example, the highly profitable and problematic finance industry from a worker's retirement account. Now, we do want to share, there are meta-studies that now show decades of research around the fact that incorporating values-associated factors, or that ESG factors that we mentioned, can be positively correlated with performance in the long run. But if you wholesale eliminate industries, for example, there are related impacts to overall diversification. And it's actually diversification that helps manage risk in any invested portfolio. And finally, reducing investments in the worst of the worst is not the same of actively investing in the types of ventures that will facilitate a just transition. That brings us to positive screens. how can we provide a way for ordinary people to invest in ventures that support a just transition to a regenerative economy? This is one of the core driving questions for Just Futures. This is tougher to do in the public market space. A lot of the types of investments we'd like to see, investment in renewable energy products, worker-owned cooperatives, small businesses, affordable housing, cooperative housing, fall within this private investment category. It is possible, but right now it's pretty difficult and expensive to do, which ultimately makes it only accessible to those who have the time and wealth to make that possible. Again, Just Futures is working towards a solution that would enable retirement investing in these kinds of projects for ordinary workers. In the meantime, there are a handful of public market products that do invest in some of these areas, renewable energy, affordable housing in particular, which you can ask your investment advisor to find and make available. Okay, so now I'll hand it off to Lisa, who will share about another layer of the screening process.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thanks all for being here. Yes, often when we think about these screens, we focus on the end of the investment chain, which company stocks or bonds is our money invested in. Again, on the slide here, you can see Amazon as an example. But the companies through which these investments are made matter too. And these companies are called asset managers. They manage the mutual funds and ETFs and decide which stocks and bonds to include. For that work, they collect fees from us, their investors. Revisiting this slide, BlackRock and Adesina are two examples of asset managers. Like with companies and funds, we can apply negative or positive screens to asset managers to further align our overall investment strategy with our values. For example, Just Futures excludes funds from BlackRock, Vanguard, and Fidelity. These are three of the world's largest asset managers. They have ESG branded funds, but their investing record follows the extractive behavior that defines most of the sector. Additionally, these asset managers have massive power. Collectively, they're often the majority owner in major corporations. How they vote on board resolutions shapes major policy decisions. For example, this majority action report outlines how they wield their power to undermine proposals that would help address racial equity. But there's a bright side. Better asset managers do exist. They have social impact missions and good proxy voting records. Adesina Social Capital is one example, and you can encourage your investment advisor to seek out options like Adesina. I think you joined this webinar today because saving through less extractive investment is important to you. My colleagues previously mentioned that, unfortunately, our current financial system requires us to rely on public markets to secure our financial futures. Still, I'm excited to share that we are discovering myriad opportunities to hold companies accountable to social justice principles. When we choose funds and asset managers, we are in a way voting with our dollars. I want us to remember, though, that our power does not end there. With our collective dollars, we can create collective power to influence asset managers to do better. Currently, our dollars are too few and too dispersed to force asset managers to follow our directives. You've probably heard some version of the statistic that the wealthiest 10% in the United States owns 84% of the money on Wall Street. But Just Futures is helping build a movement with the long-term goal of winning enough capital to our side, the side pursuing social justice, that we can shift the balance of power in increasingly bigger ways. I am now pleased to pass the mic to Andy Behar from As You Sow. He will share the tools his organization has created to allow individuals and organizations to assess their investments and describe some foundational shareholder activism work they are undertaking.
Andy, you
so much. Thank you so much for handing that off to me. And yeah, so As You Sow is a 501c3 nonprofit. We've been around since 1992, focused on corporate accountability through the lens of shareholders. So we do a great deal of work engaging corporations, literally hundreds of them. We engaged 210 companies last year, and we bring them a lot of data. We do a lot of research, and we sit down with them and try to get them to reduce material risk for all stakeholders. Now, we also evaluate mutual funds. And I'm going to show you a tool that we have on our website. And there's a lot of different levels to it. I'm going to take you through a very high level of it, but it goes very, very deep, because what we realized back in 2015, we were working on the idea of fossil fuel divestment. And a lot of people kept coming to us and going, I have no idea what I own. It's like, I know it's called the Vanguard Admiral Fund. They didn't have any idea what's inside of it. And so what we've done is have a tool that it updates once a month, and it's looking at 6,000 mutual funds and ETFs, exchange traded funds, and we'll show you everything inside of it. So if you look at a perspective of a mutual fund, you'll see the top 10 holdings. If it's a Russell 1000 fund, we're going to show you 1,000 companies and what they all do. So I'm going to take you through it quickly. So you're looking at the As You Sow website, and there's a few different ways to get to it, but I'm just going to show you kind of a very simple way. If you scroll down just a little bit, you see this Invest Your Values over here. I'm assuming everyone can see this. If you click on Invest Your Values, what this takes you to is a site that it was just working. You know what? Somehow when you do this on Zoom, it's really slowing it down. Usually pops right up. So maybe I'll go at it another way. Apologies. Well, let's see. Okay, there you go. So you can type in, for instance, you could type in the word Vanguard. And what that's going to show you is a list of all the Vanguard's mutual funds and ETFs that we have. So let's pick out the Vanguard. This is the it's called VTSAX. It's in a lot of different 401k plans because it's a total stock market index. And what you're looking at here, this D is a letter grade like A, B, C, D, F. And what we're looking at here is fossil fuels. And so if you click here, you could see these are the 200 biggest fossil fuel, big oil companies and coal companies. And you can see all the ones that are in there and the exact percentage of how much is in there. If you click here, you can see all the coal companies that are inside the fund. If you click here, you can see all the fossil fuel utilities. So these are fossil-fired utilities. There's a lot more tabs along the top, which could show you banks and insurance companies. It could show you all different things. I'm not going to go into too much detail because we also look at positive things, like these are all the clean companies that are in the that are in there as well. So a lot of different ways of looking at a mutual fund. But ultimately, what this is all based around is this idea of a report card. And when you're looking at a fund, we break it down. We don't give them one score because, you know, if your kid comes home with a report card and they just get a C in school, you don't know whether they're getting an A in math and a D in geography. So you want to know. Well, in this case, they're getting a D in fossil fuels. If you click on deforestation, now you can look, and what you see here is all the companies, again, within that same basket of stocks. And if you click, you can see this is all of the companies that produce palm oil, paper, pulp, rubber, timber, cattle, and soy. So these are all Archer Daniels Midland. These are all the folks. Now, the banks who fund all of this destruction of the rainforest are JP Morgan, Bank of America. And again, you can see exactly all the percentages and all the major consumer brands. So, you know, for instance, if you, if you're looking at it and you own, well, Pepsi is in there. Well, they're using palm oil to cook their potato chips. And that's something that you may want to know. So overall, there's 62 companies, it's 13%. And so now you get a sense of what's going on in terms of, so that's fossil fuels. You can click on, I'm sorry, that's deforestation. You can see a little bio of each of the companies. And we also have the social issues, which is down here. So you can see they get an F on the prison industrial complex. So that means that this fund owns a lot of private prisons. Now, private prisons are really the manifestation of racist policy. And you can go in and you can click and you can see everything, all the companies that are inside here involved with private prisons. Now, some of them, the red ones, are the world's largest private prison company. Now, other ones are providing, let's just say, food services or laundry services, but they've got the largest and the second largest private prison company. So if you're owning this Vanguard fund, you may want to know that it's got all of that stuff inside of it. Now, you can also go and you can look and see, well, let's sort this by fund managers. So, for instance, if you look at Vanguard, this is now sorting 103 Vanguard funds. And what you see is basically, if you own a Vanguard fund, you are deeply invested in private prisons. There's just no two ways around it. So you start to get a sense of now what's inside. And if you want to, you can go in here and you go to search funds. This is kind of the center of what we do. And you can see how everything is already all sorted, by different areas. Now, under search settings, you can, well, let's just say you can click on performance. Then you can say, you know what, I really care about 3-year financial performance. And now you can sort it by 3-year financial performance. And then you can say, I've got to get at least a C on fossil fuels, and I got to get at least a B on private prisons. And you can put in whatever you want. Now it's already resorted itself. It's that fast. And so then you can start to go and look across and say, okay, what's really going on here? And you can see all the grades for all the different funds. And you can say, all right, I want to look at that one by Fidelity. I want to get more funds. Let's look at that one. And let's look at this one. And you can compare them side by side. You hit the compare button. And now you can actually look and see, like, what are they all doing? What kind of grades do they get? But also, what's their financial performance? Like, who's outperforming who, and how does it link to the better scores? So, each person is very different. And so you need to figure out what score you want to get and the performance you want to get. So these are just, I'm taking you on a very, very high level of this. You can go incredibly deep. And one of the things that's great about it is, for instance, you can say, okay, I only want to see diversified funds, or I only want to see target date funds. Those are funds that like a 2050 fund or a 2060 fund. Those are funds that generally are the default options in most 401k and 403b plans. So again, you can sort it by that, and I could spend hours literally in here. The other thing that we do, and the easiest way to get to that, you can go to investorvalues.org as another entry point. And what you can see is these are all the plans for the big companies. So we have about 50 companies, a couple of schools. But for instance, if you're going to look at, say, Amazon, just a snapshot, this is what the Amazon report card looks like. That 62% of the money is in this default option, and that they do have that they've got $1.12 billion in fossil fuels. So if you're an employee at one of these companies, you get a very fast snapshot, but you can go deep. You can see every company contributing to each of these scores. You can see that they've got that they happen to have it's called the FTSE Social Index, sustainable option, but only 2.46% of the assets of the plan are in it. Now, this happens to outperform the target date fund, but the people in the at Amazon don't seem to either notice that or understand that. So I'm going to stop sharing because I know we want to have time for questions. But that's a very broad overview. So you can get to it either through the As You Sow website, scroll down to Invest Your Values, or go to Invest Your Values, and there's a way to get to that. But most important thing, takeaway is know what you own. Like that is how you are capitalizing a future that you want to have happen, that you want to live in. And it's just really important because that is your power. And you can use it by going and talking to your HR department. There's a tab, by the way, I didn't show you, but if you want to go talk to HR, we have letters that are written that you could template letters. Also, emails you can send to your friends at work to say, hey, why are we invested in this way out of alignment with our values? So you can organize some of your peers to then go together to HR. Because when you show up with 10 people, it's going to be a better conversation if you show up alone. So, but all the organizing tools are also on the site.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Andy. We really appreciate it and all the resources that you've put into making this a tool that's publicly accessible for folks. So I know we've already thrown a lot at you in the last 45 minutes or so, but before we move into Q&A directly, I want to give the mic to Alberto Mejia, who's the COO of a nonprofit arts organization called Fractured Atlas, who also happens to be one of our wonderful clients. And as an organization that's taken intentional steps to implement an equitable retirement plan, we thought it could be helpful for folks joining here to hear from you as someone who's done it. So to start off, why did you decide to make a change to your existing retirement plan?
Thanks, Mika. So hi, everybody. I see we're in a lot of good company. I even see an old buddy of mine, John Michael Torres. If you're still here, what's up? How are you doing? My name's Alberto, he, him pronouns, and I'm CEO at Fractured Atlas. Our mission is to make the journey from inspiration to living practice more accessible and equitable for artists and creatives. So we started down this road with Just Futures, really because I was just looking for a better administrative option. I think part of my charge as a leader is to make people's lives easier and make their work more fun and efficient. So looking to our HR director, I saw that our process with the former 401k advisor seemed to have a lot of unnecessary steps. The portal was clunky and, it was just unoptimal in a lot of ways. After kind of getting into it and looking at options out there, I thought that there might be a more important opportunity really to align with our values. So Fractured Atlas, is a organization with anti-oppression, anti-racist values that guide our work. And we've done years of consultation with, various folks in anti-racist or DEI work to sort of arrive at those values, to create some policies and practices that reflect that. And at one point in the past, I saw that with a previous facilitator, the staff had done a survey and was asking questions about our organization's investments, 401k included. And they talked about how it was important to them to have look into non-extractive or intersectional values that could be applied to the investments. So being a fan of, there's someone on this call that I was looking into, but really just being a fan of people working in the space of the trust transition. I think I came across Just Futures on LinkedIn and we started to talk. So I think that's the sort of impetus of why we did this. It really is about aligning, right? I know the values of a lot of our staff were not necessarily in alignment with what was going on in our retirement fund.
Thank you for sharing that context. And, now that you have implemented, what benefits have you seen as an organization for your staff in implementing a plan that follows these best practices that we've shared today around equity?
Yeah, if I could, as a little preamble, I think, I'm guessing a lot of folks that are on this call, not all of y'all are like, certified HR resource managers. Maybe you don't have a background steeped in finance myself. A lot of folks, I think, in the impact sector and specifically the nonprofit sector grow into roles. So I think sometimes you find yourself wanting to advocate for these types of changes, but you don't have maybe the language, the expertise to frame it up for your folks. So I just wanted to say, as an extra shout out to Just Futures, what I found was that there was, in the process of deciding and then, signing the contract and making the change, something that made sense to the board, the leadership, and the staff. There was a lot of really great distilling of these concepts, kind of like they've done today. I think really bringing it down to a human level, because that's kind of our role, I think, in the framing and getting the buy-in for these types of ideas. So that was helpful. And now that we're in the mix, I think that I've seen a tick up in terms of contributions from employees that weren't doing it before. And I think that has to do with the ease of the tools, but I also think it has to do with the values that are, at work. I think I like that how, is it perfect? No, but it's something that is a step of moving toward the center. And I think for a lot of folks, it was a practical operational step to sort of the concept of a just transition. It was an option to walk our talk individually and as an organization in our own values. I didn't mention before that we have a 5% sort of automatic contribution to employees' 401ks. So it's interesting, right? It's what are we doing with our money in terms of the company's investment, and then providing opportunity for the employees to invest in a more equitable future as well. What else did I want to say here? Yeah, I think people are really hungry for the values alignment, and I think that showed immediately in people already making more contributions. And I think by the company that I see in the chat, I think it's really important that this is one way that you can sort of show a more viable future and give people, and so people need to see that future to be able to make an investment in it. Yeah, and I do think that it has a lot to do with the culture of Just Futures too, and the way they've been accessible. There was no dumb questions. Everything was treated with a lot of dignity and respect in terms of the questions before we got started, and now that we're in it. And I also say it was super. I used to work for the city of Austin. I actually just initiated the rollover process. It was super easy, because I respect people's different attitudes. For me, I'm like, let's do this. Let's move the money. I'm out, personally, but I realize that comes with a certain level of privilege. But I know that this has been an exciting option for me personally as well.
Well, thank you so much, Alberto. We really appreciate your insights here. And I know we have a bunch of questions from the audience. We probably won't get through all of them, but let's get into some of those. So I'll turn it over to you, Alex. And if the rest of our panelists want to turn your cameras back on to join the discussion, that would be great. Alex, you're muted right now.
That is habitual. Alex Sanchin, he, him. I'm the co-founder and president of Just Futures. Thank you, Alberto, Andy, Lisa, George, and Mika for some awesome content. And we've got some amazing questions. And Alberto, you're going to be on deck first. And this is drawing from a question that Denisha had asked around. She is working at a project that is fiscally hosted by a fiscal sponsor. And she wanted to know if she could have a retirement plan that's separate from the fiscal sponsor. And what we're seeing is that generally that's very hard. But I'm curious, Alberto, like from your process, what was it like in terms of convincing stakeholders, right? And to maybe make the switch to a more values aligned retirement plan? What were some of the learnings? Or some of the challenges, maybe folks who, are in a similar situation with Denisha, where they want to move, but they have folks to convince. And, also riffing on Andy and talking about, there's organizing that needs to be done to convince HR that retirement is a social justice vehicle, right? So I'd love to hear from you, Alberto, in terms of your process, and please share.
Yeah, the process, I think if I would have given myself more time. That's my own personal, I think it's a personal issue of mine, is maybe trying to move more expediently. But I think basically having a presentation, I think earlier with the staff, like a get to know you, but would have probably been the sort of more optimal thing, even before we were sort of in talks. Like even a preamble, attending something like this, I think would make a lot of sense. Maybe even sharing this webinar with those folks who have those concerns, right? I know that there was support at the leadership level. The board was pretty excited, but of all things, there was an employee who was a little more active in the investments and was like, whoa, what's all this woo-woo stuff? But really, the staff was available and grounded for that. All her questions, which were really beyond my scope of technical knowledge, frankly, were answered by the staff. And just, reiterating that this is a fiduciary with the same, legal obligations as any other, and also that there's options still within the fund, like it still operates like others, right? Age-based, if you have a more higher risk tolerance. So I think it was like a little bit of demystifying to get the buy-in ahead of time. I hope that makes some sort of sense to folks. And I think I just want to say, anonymous attendee, like I didn't in terms of processes, like think about putting on, I've had CRM processes that were way more involved than this was, right? In terms of the admin, and it wasn't without bumps. It was definitely not without bumps in terms of the transition to the other from the previous 401k advisor and record keepers, but we were really well supported in that throughout the process. We weren't alone. We weren't left to our own devices. Like, you guys handle that. I think it was extra supportive. So, there weren't many people that were drawn into the process beyond myself, the HR director. We really worked. It was kind of us working with Just Futures. There weren't a lot of people, I guess, for lack of better words, dragged into the administrative process.
Thank you for sharing, Alberto. I know there's a bunch of questions in the chat around, plan design and contributions. So let me turn it to Mika. I'm going to fire off 3 questions from the chat, and I hope you touch on them. So first, is there a best practice for the employment contribution percentage? That's one question. Then another question is, can you speak about progressive employer contributions where lower paid employees receive higher percentages and higher paid employees receive lower percentages? Are there examples of orgs that have done this? And then the last question from Naomi, have you seen examples of plans that do not tie non-elective contributions to a percentage of salary, but rather base the contribution upon a lump sum or another approach? We're curious about options to center equity for lower paid staff.
Yes, all great questions. So to take the first one, what best practices around what that amount should be. In our initial needs assessment survey, we found that many nonprofits, if they're offering retirement benefits, are doing somewhere between 2 and 5%. Obviously, the more generous, the better through our lens. If you think about what someone needs to save in order to take their income and requirement, the replacement rate is usually set at about 9%. And so you'll see industry recommendations for an individual to try to aim saving for 12 to 15% of their income for retirement. And so to the extent that an organization can help get folks, a good portion of the way towards that 12 to 15% goal, that's great. In terms of the question about either doing a progressive match or a flat match, I haven't actually seen a setup where lower paid employees are getting a higher percent. My guess is because the compliance testing that would be involved in doing that sort of customized of a solution would be a little bit more labor intensive, and so might be more expensive for a plan sponsor to implement. We do see folks do a flat dollar contribution. So instead of a percent, everyone gets, $5,000 a year towards their retirement. And, in general, I think that trying to make a decision around what's more equitable, a percent based or a flat dollar, can depend in part on whether the underlying salaries are set up to be equitable, right? That is so important. We want people to be paid equitably as a baseline. We do have clients who take that flat approach. A lot of them tend to have a relatively flat salary structure already. And the reason I'm hesitant to sort of wholesale recommend that approach, why we didn't put that as the best practice in our slides, is that organizations usually have limited resources to work with. And, we see that there are lifetime movement leaders, or even just folks working in nonprofit for a career, who have no retirement savings, who are facing poverty in old age. And so If there are limited resources to distribute, we don't want to say necessarily, at the expense of folks who have been working in this space for a long time to do the flat dollar. If an organization can be generous to everyone, if they're in a position to say, hey, let's put 20 grand a year into everyone's retirement accounts, then great. Yes, that absolutely makes sense. But generally, we present this as sort of ideally working in tandem with an organization having equitable salaries.
Mika, do we have time for one more question? I know we're over, but what was the plan?
Yeah, we're already over. Let's go over by a few minutes. This is being recorded, so we'll be able to share it with folks. And then, yeah, let's do one more question and then we can close out.
Cool. So this question is to George and Andy. Target retirement funds have been so helpful for participants who don't want to worry about how to invest, rebalance, et cetera, their portfolios. But are there any clean target retirement funds? Let's have George go first and then followed by Andy.
Yeah, I mean, you did the air quotes, clean. One of the things we like to say, to be 100% transparent, right? That our solution isn't 100% clean, right? It's incredibly difficult to do so within the public market space. But what we are trying to do, much in the way that Andy with As You Sow is doing, is provide transparency to give a view of what's going on inside a given fund or a portfolio or target date fund, so that individuals have a perspective on where their assets are invested. Andy, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, there is no perfect. It's just what you need to do is figure out what are your values and what are your priorities. So I can tell you that As You Sow, we have a target date fund that's by a group called Natixis, Natixis. It gets much better grades than like a Vanguard target date fund, a BlackRock target date fund, a Fidelity back. It gets way better grades, particularly on climate and on justice issues. And it's been around for 7 years and it outperforms them every year. So if you just want to make more money, you'd go with that. If you also want to get better scores, but again, the scores are B's and C's, they're not A's, because target date funds are funds of funds. So within a target date fund, you've got a large cap, you got a mid cap, you got a bond, you got an international. There might be 12 funds within a target date fund, and they're also being reweighted every year. When you're younger, having more equities, and when you're older, having more bonds. So again, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. This is about moving capital and moving your power. And then also one last thing I'd have to say is that another thing that we're doing, and we're doing it at Vestwell, and we're going to be piloting it, and I think we're launching it in just a few more weeks, is proxy voting. That right now, if you're in a Vanguard fund, you're handing off your power of the proxy vote, and Vanguard votes 98% of the time with management. Everyone at As You Sow is going to be voting across. We have a voting platform called As You Vote, and so we'll all be voting in a very ESG aligned way. So voting for all of our resolutions, of course, but also for all of the other pro ESG resolutions, as well as against a lot of board members who there's not enough diversity on the board. If the CEO is getting overpaid, we vote against 80% of the CEO pay packages. So this is the next level is taking back your power, because that is really what a lot of people have abdicated, not even knowing they have it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andy. Thank you, George. And I think we're 5 minutes over, so maybe turn it over to Mika
Yeah, I was going to say that's a great note to end on. And we will do some email follow-up on some of the questions that we didn't get to. But thank you again to everyone who joined or is watching this recording. Thank you again to our illustrious speakers for sharing their knowledge, to our wonderful co-sponsors. Lisa dropped a link in the chat to a very brief evaluation form. We appreciate any feedback you have on this event. And before we sign off, we just want to say that we hope this is the beginning, not the end of the conversation. If you have questions about the content that we didn't get to, or that's more individual to your organization or situation, please reach out to us. If you want help assessing the current design, fee structure, or investments in your current plan, reach out to us. If you've never offered retirement, but you want to know how much work it's going to be, reach out to us. We are here to be a resource to you. We'll be sending an email follow-up, as I mentioned, with the recording for this webinar, the slide deck, some of the resources mentioned, and hopefully some more answers for you. Thank you again, and goodbye for now.
Thanks, everybody.